Okay, good evening. More quiet on the front row. Welcome to this talk. This is a repeat of one I did before, and I did it on literally the 150th anniversary to the evening of the foundation of the first Baptist Church in Altrincham. This is a little bit afterwards, but it's going to be just as exciting as the first one, and thank you all for coming. So we're celebrating that 150th anniversary, and 50 years ago there was the 100th anniversary when Paul Beasley Murray was minister at the time. So I'm just going to tell you roughly what I'm going to cover during this talk. I'm going to talk really about the early years of the Baptists, up to about 1905, 1906. Now, if you think you've seen some ups and downs in Altrincham Baptist Church and its life, I can tell you it's nothing compared to what happened in the early Baptist churches in Altrincham. Just wait till you hear this. And I'm going to talk about why the church split into two churches, why the church here went literally bankrupt. I'm going to talk about persecution and discrimination, why there have been different names for the churches. The first hymn sung by Altrincham Baptist Church, which actually we sang at the celebrations, didn't we? The role of women in the church. Were there any suffragettes? I'm going to ask the question and answer. How politically active were the early Baptists? And the answer you'll find is very. I'm going to answer the question is why the minister here tried to go to prison but was thwarted by his congregation. And then an amazing move of the Holy Spirit that transformed the ministry and congregation and built the congregation really into something new and vibrant. I'm going to tell you why ABC organised a major and very successful mission in Altrincham beginning at 10:15 at night and with the main event beginning at midnight. And I'm going to talk about why 4,000 to 5,000 people went to the River Bollin to watch an amazing event. So stay tuned for all of this. We're going to have a break partway through for a very quick cup of tea because we have a lot of material to get through. And you're going to be familiar with some of the faces you can see on the screen, so just remember them now. So, the early Baptists in Altrincham. And I want to go back, first of all, in time to the death of Queen Victoria. Now, recently, of course, our own Queen Elizabeth II has died, and we've got King Charles III, and we're going to be talking a lot about King Charles I and II coming up. And in the church just above, in the main chapel, there was something put up which said that this church, and people could sign a visitor's book, and the idea was a condolence book. This church desires to place on record its deep gratitude to Almighty God for the long and prosperous reign of our beloved Queen Victoria, for her noble example as wife, mother Christian, her tact and wisdom as ruler, and her unfailing sympathy as a woman, as well as for the happy growth in religious liberty that has characterized her reign. It is the Church's hope that all its members will earnestly seek the comforting grace of the Heavenly Father for the royal household and God's religious blessings for His Majesty the King. And that was in 1901, and the resolution was passed at a meeting. But I'm going to come back to that because if you look, it talks about the happy growth in religious liberty, and I want to answer the question as to why they put that in. So, I'm now going to take you further back in time to the Civil War. And you might think, why is that relevant? Why is the English Civil War relevant to what happened here? And I'm going to ask you a question now, so if we can have a response. If you'd been involved in the Civil War, not necessarily fighting, who would you have supported? Would you have supported Parliament, the Roundheads, or would you have been on the side of King and Country? My wife would have automatically said King and Country. So, go on, quick show of hands. No wrong answer here. Well, not really. Who'd have supported King and Country? Okay, a few there. Who'd have been on the side of the Roundheads and Parliament? Okay, a smaller number. Right. Well, I want to just do a thought experiment now, just to explain what I'm talking about. And I want you to go to a completely different country now. This is somewhere else in the world. It's now. And imagine you're in that country, you're a citizen, and you're told that the only way you can go to church is in the state-controlled church. You're going to find this it sounds very familiar. You can't have meetings outside that church meeting, and in those church meetings, people will monitor you. you can only follow the set prayers that are given to you from the state. And your ruler believes that ruler, first of all, they want to suppress democracy, and they believe they've got a God-given right to tell you what to do and to rule your country. Does that sound familiar? Well, it could do, but actually, that was England in the time of Charles I, before the Civil War. This was not a free country. So, I'm afraid the correct answer, I think, is you should have been on the side of Parliament and democracy and for the freedom of religion, which is what these people were, what it was all about, against someone who was actually wanting to impose their rule. So I'm sorry to have pulled that one on you for those who voted the wrong way. But let's look at the dissenters. Now, these are actually our direct predecessors, and they're generally called nonconformists and later called the Free Churches. And they separated from the Church of England from the 16th century onwards. In the Act of Uniformity, they were defined as Presbyterian, Baptists, Congregationalists, and Quakers. And later, there's a debate about this. Methodists were probably added to that because they pleaded the Act of Toleration, and the Salvation Army and Brethren possibly later came into the nonconformists. And they're generally the successors to the Roundheads in the Civil War and fighting for freedom and freedom of religion. And what happened at the restoration of Charles II, many were actually forced out of the Church of England. Many more were forced out of the Church of England. So was Cheshire, where we are, we weren't in Greater Manchester then, we're in Cheshire, Roundhead or Royalist? Well, actually, Cheshire was on the right side, okay, I'm pleased to say. Sir George Booth of Dunham, local stately home and everything else, was a Presbyterian, although he's moderate, and he later actually came into sided with King Charles II in the Restoration. Sir William Brereton, who also fought, was his son-in-law, was Hand of the Horn. He was a Puritan, he was much more strict. Only Chester supported the king in the Civil War. And in fact, if you go to Chester, you can stand on the walls. There's King Charles I's tower, and that's where he stood there and watched his soldiers being defeated at the Battle of Rowthorne Moor, which you could see in the distance. So the Civil War legacy was actually very important in these times. Why was it important in Victorian times? Well, there was continuing discrimination against the dissenters, the nonconformists, and Roman Catholics too, which began again with the restoration of King Charles II. So basically, you had to use the Book of Common Prayer. Church of England changes forced many into dissenting. In 1664, the Conventicle Act said that 5 or more people gathered together for prayer must use the Book of Common Prayer. You couldn't have your own prayer. And if you read the Book of Common Prayer, there are some things today we just could not agree with. And then in 1665, there was the 5 Mile Act, and ministers had to take an oath not to agree to try and change the church or state. And if they refused to do so, they were banned from being anywhere within 5 miles of their parish. Their congregation had to decamp to at least 5 miles away, as otherwise they were arrested. So actually, if you went to school and read about, the restoration of the monarchy after the Civil War, and this is all wonderful and after Cromwell, actually it wasn't, because you're reading the wrong history books there. It was actually not as good as you might think. So looking further at the Civil War legacy, John Bunyan, you know his name, Pilgrim's Progress. He fought in the Civil War. He spent 12 years in prison for holding an illegal service, which was just a standard service. The Test Act for holders of office was only repealed in 1828. So you couldn't hold an office in the country if you're a Baptist or other nonconformist. In 1689, there was the Toleration Act, which did help. And until 36, you couldn't hold your own weddings. You had to have them in a Church of England church. Until 1860, you were banned from grammar schools, okay? And only from 1871 could you hold any office in a university, but you still couldn't teach divinity or become a college head. So actually, things weren't that good. It was only gradually these things changed. And you can see why the Baptists, and when they did that thing about Queen Victoria, mentioned that, because actually it was quite recent when all these things were changing. So I want to talk about nonconformist ideals. And these stem from all of that. And really, these are freedom of religion. That's taken for read, really. Sola Scriptura, which is the idea, is the Protestant idea that the authority of the written word is paramount and it rises above what the church says. That's the Bible, is paramount. There should be no state church. There should be no separation of church and state. They believed that all should be equal before the law. They believed in toleration. These were actually quite modern ideas, aren't they? This is what the nonconformists fought for. And no one religion should be favoured over any other by the state. They believed in democracy. And they believed that the Church of England should revert to its broad church state. Now, just let me explain that what you now know as the Church of England, this may sound a radical thought, but actually it's true, is a Victorian invention. The Church of England before that time really was a completely different thing. It's all changed in the halfway through Victorian times with what's called the Oxford movement. And so when you see candles in churches, you see these lovely bright robes and everything, you see bowing, all those things, those were actually a Victorian invention. Before that, the Church of England was actually a much broader church. And what the nonconformists felt was it had moved away and they'd had to leave because of that moving of the Church of England to a very different type of idea. And also they believed in an equal vote in formal church matters, and that was for men and women. And that, of course, is based on Scripture. All are equal before God. I want to look at another person now who's called Thomas Helwys. And he wrote a book. He was one of the early Baptists, and he had to, in England, he had to flee to Amsterdam. And he wrote, and this was radical at the time, revolutionary, for men's religion to God is between God and themselves. The king shall not answer for it, neither may the king be judged between God and man. Let them be heretics, Turks, Jews, or whatsoever. It appertains not to the earthly powers to punish them in the least measure. Now, by Turks, what he meant was Muslims, because that's how they understood it at the time, because that was the main context. But think about that. That is, in 1612, he's saying that all religions should be treated equally before the state. And that at the time was hugely radical. We almost take it for granted now. And that idea actually permeated into America. And the First Amendment to the American Constitution says that Congress shall make no law representing an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And that was actually prompted by a Baptist church, and that was the First Amendment. And you'll notice that it talks about the freedom of the press, but also freedom of speech and freedom of religion, basically. So again, those were nonconformist ideals that permeated over to America. So I want to go back to Queen Victoria now. We are getting round to the local church here, but this is all actually quite relevant. It's often been questioned how sympathetic she was to nonconformists. Certainly, when the Reverend McKennell, who's the guy at the bottom left, who is minister of the local Congregational Church, went to see her, apparently she stood for him, and that was regarded as a significant thing because she generally didn't stand, she actually stood to greet him. That was for her Diamond Jubilee. But there was a bit of an interesting dynamic with Manchester. Manchester, as you know, has always been a radical city, and still is. The Mancunians, to celebrate the relief of the siege of Manchester, decided to erect a statue of Oliver Cromwell in front of a cathedral. And you can see on the picture there he is. It is no longer there. It is in a park now in Manchester, but that was there. And Allegedly, she refused to come to Manchester, to the centre of Manchester, because the person who she foresaw was responsible for beheading King Charles I was outside the cathedral. And was it provocative by Mancunians? I think possibly yes. But also she refused to come to the opening of the town hall, the new town hall in Albert Square. And that was because there was a guy called Abel Hayward, who was a radical mayor, and I'm not having anything to do with these revolutionaries, so she refused to come. So that was her view of what was going on. So let's now turn to Altrincham. I'm going to look at the first nonconformist church in Altrincham, and the first overall one was actually at Ringway, which was an Anglican church, and then converted, in fact, to Presbyterian. And then when they were evicted by the local lord, as it were, who marched into one of the sermons and dragged the preacher out, and then they formed their own church. So where was this first church in Altrincham? Or chapel, as you should correctly call it. Well, that's a picture of a house, so that is not the church. But if you look on the right, this is the only picture we have of it. You can just see the edge of a chapel there, can't you? And that's a slightly older picture, but it's now called, Delfor. And it's on the Downs, or is it? Something like that, anyway. Delcor. It's on the Downs. It's the shops as you go up on the right from the bottom of the Downs. And if you look, you'll see that the outline of the chapel behind is still there. And there used to be steps at the front. So, in fact, if you go into the chapel, you will find... I nipped in once, and someone diverted the people's attention, and I nipped up to the top, and you could see the outline of the chapel inside. So if you're ever shopping, see if you could repeat the thing. You have to go up the stairs. And there apparently was a baptistry at the bottom. So let's look at the person who was involved in founding this. He was called Robert Wesley Aitken, and as you can imagine, he was of Methodist family. He was vicar of Crosby in the Isle of Man, and that's the slightly eccentric chapel he built, which has got fortifications on it. And he left the Church of England to become a Methodist and a dissenter, effectively. And he was a revivalist preacher. He founded what was called the Christian Society, but more locally and in the north, they were called the Jumpers and the Ranters. Now, let me explain why, because what they did was, I think, basically, they were an early charismatic church. But locally, they were, and in the northwest where they were predominant, they were called the Jumpers and Ranters because they used to jump in excitement over the pews, and the Ranters because they had open prayers and things, I think. So you can look at it two ways, but they got a pretty bad press locally. And they were largely a working class following. In fact, Hope Hall in Liverpool was the headquarters. It's later the Everyman Theatre. And he arrived in 1833 in Manchester like a whirlwind, it is said. And through him, the chapel on the Downs was built. And they put up a minister there, and they had the Jumpers and the Ranters on the Downs. So inside, as I mentioned, that's the picture I furtively took, so you can see the outline of the chapel. What we're going to do is introduce two other nonconformist churches in Altrincham. Before we come round to where we come from, because these are all actually quite relevant, you'll see. And basically the chapel on the Downs closed. They didn't survive. They went to other churches, the Jumpers and the Ranters. And so we had a new church which came in, which was Bowden Downs Congregational Church, which you may have heard of. And it started at the vacant Downs Chapel. And they bought it, a guy called Ibbotson bought it for £465 in 1839. And they had a congregation of 10. And they grew hugely, and they became one of the preeminent churches in the country. Absolutely fascinating story in its own right. But they outgrew the small chapel at the beginning, foot of the Downs, so they bought a new site. And they had some interesting reasons for moving, which I've read in their minute books, was first of all, they didn't like the railway. Now, we'll talk about the railway again later, but the railway station was where roughly, it's on Railway Street, believe it or not, it's not there now. So that was where it was. It's where Total Fitness and all those other places are, and that was the main railway station. It was called Bowden Terminus, and the original Altrincham station was roughly where the main flyover is, the other side. The new one combined the two. So this was really the main station for this part of Altrincham. So they didn't like these trains, and also they felt that there were too many noisy people around. So they moved out of the Downs Chapel, and there's their new chapel further up the road. And, there's a little map of it there, and you'll probably recognise it. Oops. Because it's now called the Upper Room, chapel up there. Now, their deeds prohibited the Downs Chapel being used as a school. Their main chapel is being used as a school. So for a while, they used the Downs Chapel as a Sunday school so as to not breach the terms of the deeds. And then they set up an Oxford Road mission, which was at a property which was the British School, later became the British School, which I'll come back to. And there's only one photograph of the inside of the British School. I'm going to tell you where it is shortly. That's the only photograph, which is difficult to date, really. But there we are. That's the main hall. And that was used as Sunday school, mission hall, and there were school rooms and everything else. So where was it? It's on British School Road, surprisingly. But there's the road. Interestingly enough, that changed its name later to Oxford Road. So if you walk down here, out of here, you'll find it would have just been down there. And you see that passage there? That's the little back passage into Sainsbury's. And in fact, that's the site of the old British School, which is also relevant to Altrincham Baptist Church, as you'll see. So then we want to look at another church which started. Anyone recognise that one? Okay, it's Trinity Presbyterian Church, as was, and Altrincham Baptist Church rented it for a while. We called it the Delamere Centre on Delamere Road. It used to have a nice spire. It doesn't now. And you may recognise, there's Altrincham Baptist Church. Have a look at that closer in with people you might recognise when we were worshipping there. Very briefly, they were called the Scottish Church because they had lots of Scottish people in, not surprisingly. And on the 22nd of December 1867, they took over the chapel at the foot of the Downs because it became empty. And their new building opened then, and they moved out on the 22nd of September 1872, which is about 150 years ago. Think about that. So you're going to see why that's relevant in a second. Just a little thing, that's wedding of my older daughter there with Andrew Hardcastle, conducting it in that church, the new church that they built. And there's one other relevant church to our story, which is this one, and you won't recognise that. This was a chapel which was next to Chapel Street off Regent Road. You probably recognise it from an older photograph there. It's actually on the site where the old public toilets are, but if you go up Regent Road, it's on the left, and it's that big modern block of flats. So if you stand there, that was what it was. And this was the Altrincham Congregational Church. You remember, Congregationalists and Baptists are very closely aligned. The only difference is believers' baptism. Everything else in doctrine and practice is the same. And they were really the poor church of Altrincham. And they started at the Downs Chapel as well. That was slightly earlier, and they moved to Regent Road. And they also they bought it off the Methodists. It was previously a Methodist church. And then they sold it off, and they moved down to the British School area to go throw in their lot with Bowden Downs Congregational Mission down there. So we're now going to come to the Baptists in Altrincham. So I'm going to ask you a question. What do you think? We're going to vote on this. What do you think the first Baptist church in Altrincham was called? Was it Hale Road Baptist? Was it Bowden Baptist? Was it Altrincham Baptist? The Tabernacle? Railway Street Baptist? Or the Downs Baptist Chapel? So go on, it doesn't matter if you get it wrong. Who thinks our first church in Altrincham was called Hale Road Baptist? Got one there. Bowden Baptist? One or two there, that's good. Altrincham Baptist? Oh, yep, there we are. The Tabernacle. Oh, come on, all right, we're doing quite well. Railway Street Baptist. And finally, the Downs Baptist Chapel. Okay, there's no worry about getting this wrong. There is a right answer. And the right answer is actually Bowden Baptist. That was the name of the first one. And because that they took over the Downs Chapel, and technically it was just in Bowden. And oddly enough, they were looking to Bowden. They thought it was a good name. And can you see on the Old Ordnance Survey map, it's actually named there as a Baptist chapel, and you can see there's a vestry. Wasn't that big? And just to remind you, there's the side view of it. I wish the photographer just moved a bit to one side, and that would have been great. And the first minister was a guy here called John Betts. And he was aged 58 when he came here. And although he was minister, it was really a temporary job. He was just coming to see if it worked and to see if he could actually attract a congregation. And he was a missioner for the Lancashire and Cheshire Association of Baptist Churches. And, he'd had one previous church where he actually, very modern, he'd started in a warehouse, and he was very energetic because he got up at 5 o'clock every morning to study and write rather him than me. So that's John Betts. And he called together a first church meeting on the 29th of September 1872, which is why we've just celebrated the 150th of the first Baptist chapel in Altrincham. And they met, quite literally, to begin with, at a house. We don't know where it was, unfortunately. It was somewhere in Bowden. And they had 26 members to start the church. Now, where did they come from? I'm not going into great detail about this, but almost certainly from the former Altrincham Congregational Church and Bowden Congregational. And in fact, I've tracked down all those churches and found early movements of people, but not technically the first members. But we do know that there's quite a lot of support from Bowden Downs Congregational. And because Baptists and congregations are very closely related, quite often Baptists would be in congregational churches. And that was where they were quite happy to be there. So the first Baptist chapel. It was effective. You'll see that what happened was that the Downs Chapel was a starter chapel for different churches. So we've had the Jumpers and the Ranters. We've got two congregational churches, one Presbyterian, and the Baptist starting as a house church. And we were recognised by Bowden Downs in 1872. And we rented the chapel, moved out from the house for £55 a year, and purchased the Presbyterian fit-out that's the Scottish Church, remember, for £100 with Baptist Union funds. So actually we got a grant to do that. So there we are. Bowden Baptist Church. There you are again. So John Betts, he only had a 3-month contract because they weren't sure this was going to work. But actually it did work, so they extended his contract. But they needed to get a full-time minister. So this is the man they got in, who is called William Llewellyn. You might guess he's of Welsh ancestry. And he was fresh out of Spurgeon's College. He was a student. He came straight into the ministry. And his brief biography says he was of a fervent religious faith. And it's quite a nice story because he was a bachelor, and then he married a lady called Annie Barlow here in 1877. So there's a bit of a love story going on there. And I think her dad was a local caterer. And he had his induction at the church, at the chapel. And he said he came to Bowden with some feelings of dread, as I heard it was a suburb of Manchester and the people are very wealthy. And I am not one of the upper 10. However, when I look to Christ, those fears fade away. I hope by the strength and grace of God that we will leave our mark upon the neighbourhood and upon the community around it. So that's Bowden. They're looking to Bowden really as their first inspiration. What he meant by the upper 10 was the top 10%. And you have to remember at the time, although Altrincham is now quite a well-off place, it wasn't at the time. And in fact, Bowden was the rich area and later Dunamassy. But Altrincham itself was quite a poor area, and only more recently did it sort of effectively go up market. So that was his induction. So then but they couldn't immediately launch because they needed to have a proper launch. So they wanted to do that. That was on the 28th of February 1873. And it was delayed due to the main preacher being on sabbatical. He's a guy called Alexander MacLaren, who's quite important in the history of this church. So let's look at him. That's a picture of him. And he was minister of Union Chapel in Manchester. And that was a mixed congregation. Because it was called a Union Chapel, it was a mixture of Presbyterians, Baptists, and Congregationalists. And there are a lot of those still around. They've tended to become more Baptist, but that's their history. He was president quite regularly of the Lancashire and Cheshire Association of Baptists. He was twice president of the Baptist Union. He was a gifted preacher, and he had a worldwide audience. He was so famous that his sermons were written down every Sunday and printed and distributed to English-speaking nations around the world during the following weeks. And you can read his sermons, and actually they're quite interesting. I've got a book of them. So he was the first preacher, and he had a particular interest in this. He wasn't, however, have you heard of Spurgeon? He was very different. Spurgeon's College, he had a huge church in London. MacLaren was a very shy and retiring person, actually. He was a great preacher, but he wasn't going out setting up churches. Spurgeon set up churches all place. He would just rather encourage people behind the scenes to set up churches. A very different personality. But he had, as I say, a particular interest in Altrincham. And what MacLaren said at his first speech was, in this growing neighbourhood, there's been opened a place of worship where God's truth will be faithfully and lovingly preached. You preach Christ, yet not a person, nor even a name, but Christ in you crucified. In that a doctrine is embedded and becomes the vehicle of the proclamation of the person. I take it that with the staple truth, the alpha and omega of the truth to be proclaimed here. If it is not so, I do not care if this church's doors are never opened again. That's a bit strong, isn't it? There we are. The one thing that binds a man to his Redeemer is his personal acceptance of and adherence to his great work. Without that, nothing is of any account. So, Bowden Baptist, their problem was they soon outgrew the chapel. They had very quickly grew to a congregation of 300, and technically the chapel only fitted 100. They had 60 believers' baptisms in the first 14 months, which is just amazing from a start-up church, isn't it? There were possible links with Manchester City Missioners supporting them. They had problems, though, with drunks crashing into the Sunday evening services at the door. Altrincham was quite an alcoholic place in Victorian times, may still be in our day. And their growth was actually aided by what we call the Moody and Sankey missions, which, if you remember, were a bit like, do you remember Billy Graham? It was that sort of thing. And they were an American revivalist preacher, and Sankey sang. And they had a huge impact, and particularly on Manchester. People flocked to see them, and actually I think that was part of the encouragement to growth, the sort of national evangelism that was going on. So let's just have a little look at what they did, because they also had outdoor services. So what they would do in the summer after the evening service, they clear the drunks out of the way outside, and then they come outside. Now, if you recognise that picture, you're looking along Railway Street. So Total Fitness now is down the side, and at the moment Toast is there. That used to be Barclays Bank and the Lancashire Yorkshire Bank before that. Do you recognise that? And there's the big lamp at the bottom, and see the taxi cabs down there and the lamp, and they would come round this bit of the lamp and sort of block the street and do open air services. And actually that was a popular place for people to assemble and do things like that. So they were overcrowded, so they decided they needed a new chapel. So they started searching for one in 1877, and they talked with the Stamford Estate about a site on the junction of Delamere Road and St John's Road junction, the junction there, but nothing happened. So that's why they ended up on Hale Road, because there really wasn't much suitable land around, and the Earl of Stamford controlled just about everything. So they came to this place, which is here, and can you recognise just that place there? That's where we are now. And it's a very narrow site. And that explains why this chapel here was built in a very narrow way and very high and very deep down. This is well below road level where we're talking now. There were no houses here, but that was about to become a building site down with the street down here with Barham Street. The house, were going to be built all the way down. So they needed to raise funds. Now, this was overwhelmingly a poor congregation. They had one rich man, a guy called Frank Spence, and I'll tell you, his dad was a rich industrialist in Salford. So he was the treasurer, which is a really good thing to get him on board so he could help raise funds and donate. And they had a tea party. Victorians loved tea parties. You were always having church tea parties. March 1877. And there were 100 people there, and they brought the proposal to build a new chapel and buy the site. The trouble is they couldn't get a commercial mortgage. There wasn't anything really available for them. So what they did was they paid a huge ground rent. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot, £25 and a shilling, but actually in those days it was a lot. And they got the site. That was how a lot of sites were developed. You pay a rent charge or a ground rent, and in return you'd agree to buy the buildings. That was security for the owner. And if you didn't do it or didn't pay the ground rent, then they took the site back. That's why a lot of us in the north and Manchester area have ground rents and rent charges. And that was how it was done. It was an early way of financing buildings. Basically, they took the equivalent of somewhere between 3 and 5 houses on Barham Street. But the ground rent was to be a problem later. But the catch was the deeds, when they bought, said that they had 1 year to build the chapel. Otherwise, they lost the site. So they needed an architect. So they got this guy who's called William Owen. He was aged 26. That's quite young to be an architect to design a chapel. And he lived on Ashley Road, and his offices were at 134 Deansgate. There he is when he's a bit older. If you want to see another building of his, go to Hale Cemetery, and he designed the chapel there, but he designed a lot of buildings in North Wales. Now, they also needed a builder. So they went to get Mr. Pennington. But he's also an undertaker, which is quite interesting. In fact, Penningtons, apparently, the families lived until quite not that long ago. I remember Brian Waterson telling me in Altrincham, in one of the houses just going towards Hale. So how do you design the chapel? They had to do this in a hurry. And there's the architect's model we still have, and that is the front of the chapel with the design. You'll notice it used to have a tower and steps at the front like that. And that is the architect's model that William Owen produced. And then that's the back. And the back is not the same. That was demolished, that extension, and it was replaced in 1908 by what we currently have as the extension there. So that was the chapel design. And the chapel had paraffin lamps to light it. So you can imagine those create quite a bit of smell, I should think. It was poorly ventilated. There were no toilets. So just think about that. There was no electricity. And the only way they could heat it was from a coke boiler in the back, and regularly ministers and deacons would come to stoke up the boiler in the morning to get the chapel warm for a Sunday morning service. But it was built, so they didn't lose the land. Whew. And there you are. That's a later ordnance survey map, if you can see. Where we are now is at the end, and you can see the houses at Barham Street were then built, and you can see that they would have continued them on, but for us building those. I'm going to show you an early picture of the chapel, and this is sometime after 1908, and it's when the extension was built, and it's a harvest festival. You always get photographs of churches at harvest festivals, and you can see that there's the organ. We removed that when Justin Dennison here was minister and sold off bits to fund the refurbishment we did. And there were 2 doors either side. The deacon's vestry was to the right, and deacons would meet for prayer before the service and then come out. And you can see the organ there. And then there's an earlier one, which actually you saw a Sunday or 2 ago. That was, and that is sometime before 1908, but I have no idea when. It could be certainly early 1900s, late 1800s. And you can see it's very different. That was before the extension was done. The doors are in more close together. Now we've only got one on the left in the current chapel. And there's no organ. So we'll come back to how they managed with that. The choir would have sat, you can see there's a communion table, they would have sat in the pews either side quite often. So that is the oldest photograph we have of the inside. Unfortunately, we don't get many photographs because they just didn't have the money for cameras, really. And here's an old photograph of the outside, and you can see the steps, and then you had to go into that open porch. And there was always a problem because when they had a funeral, if they wanted to get the coffin in, they couldn't actually get it round the corner, and they had to tip it up to get it round. And inside, you can actually just see the memorial stones for when the church was first founded, and that's one there with the name of Alexander McLaren on it. It's the wrong date, by the way, unfortunately, on that slide. Here's a later picture, and I think the person at the right there is Paul Beasley Murray, getting ready to preach. One of the ministers who was minister when I was first here. And then there's one, again, probably around the same time, taken from the platform. And I used to play piano in the worship band and swing around sometimes, play guitar from there. So that's a familiar sight, if you remember it, before we took out all the pews. I've got one more, which is of a wedding from someone called John Campbell. It's his daughter's wedding. There we are. And again, you can see the organ. So going back to what they designed, well, have you ever been along Deansgate and looked to your left before you get to Deansgate Station? Next time, please have a look there and you will see that building. And I think that their initial inspiration came from that particular building and was designed by a famous architect called Waterhouse. It was a congregational chapel. And I think that they were thinking on the train as they went in, because they went in to meet the architect on Deansgate, and they would have got off at what was then called Knott Mill Station, now Deansgate Station, and thought, ooh, that's a good idea. And you could, ooh, there he is. So William, they probably went in and said to William, what about this? Now, there's a lot of some jokes in Baptist publications at the time that designing a chapel, the deacons would get together and they'd say, let's have a bit of Romanesque. Let's go for a bit of Greek, shall we? Classical Greek and different styles. And everything was just came together, and then the architect would try and have to make his best out of all of this. So there's another picture of it. And you can see actually it's designed to look like Venice. Interestingly enough, there is Venice. So you can see some familiarity. If you ever go to Venice, that, by the way, if they tell you that's the original tower, is not. It crashed in an earthquake and is a modern reproduction, but they don't tell you that. But I also think they had regard to this particular chapel, or church rather, which is the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi. And look at that. Looks a bit familiar, doesn't it? So I think William Owen thought, well, let's move them a bit that way. So that's partly what it came up with. So it's an Italian-style church. The inside, we've got an unusual vaulted ceiling, and I think that is based on a church in Rome called in Vincoli, which I visited, and that's got a vaulted ceiling. And the reason I think they did that was because Alexander McLaren had been to Italy, if you remember, and that's why their first opening service was delayed, and he gave talks regularly about Italian architecture. And he loved this church, so I just wonder if there's a connection there. It's an amazing place if you ever go. So they had to what they did first was lay the memorial stones, and you have to have some form of ceremony. So the two people were invited, Peter Spence, the father of Frank, the treasurer, and Frank donated £100, which is a good starting fund, isn't it? You know, it was a good start. And a guy called Mr. Horton, who was a wealthy businessman from Liverpool, who donated a lot to help fund churches in Liverpool. And they're also hoping he'd do the same here. And he made a good speech, but he didn't donate anything. Oh dear. But something went wrong because Alexander McLaren had to stand in, because neither Frank nor Peter Spence could attend. They were called away on business, so he's actually quite a good substitute. And he's made a little joke and said, well, I'm here, but I'm not paying the £100 that the Spences have agreed to pay. And as he had no time to prepare anything to talk, he said, I rose without knowing what I was going to say, and I sit down not knowing what I've said. And therefore, between the two, you've got something very genuine. I hope that God's blessing, which is the root and source of all prosperity, might attend you. Interestingly enough, McKennill also spoke. He was from Bowden Downs Congregational Church up the road, and that, of course, was the very rich church by then. So, they held the ceremony on the 1878, Thursday, December the 18th, 1:30 p.m, and there was a tea afterwards. But they cut short the laying of the memorial stones. And by the way, you can still see Alexander MacLaren's memorial stone if you come into the church here, the chapel, on your left, just to the left of the lift, have a look, and it's there. That's Alexander MacLaren. I made sure that was kept. Andrew Hawkes was very keen to work that one as well. So they had a tea afterwards, but they cut short the thing because it was one of the coldest winters in memory. And so they hurried away afterwards as quickly as they could to have tea and had their main speeches there. At this place, anyone recognise where that is? Well, it's a primitive Methodist chapel. The primitive Methodists were a denomination set up as a counteract what they thought were Methodists becoming too rich. It was a very working class movement. And you probably recognise it as the Club Theatre on Oxford Road as you go down. If you go down to the left, you come to Sainsbury's, down to the left of it. So that's where the first meeting where they did their speeches was held. And then they held an evening fundraising evening. Now, by that time, actually, Frank Spencer had actually just resigned as treasurer. He still carried on attending. So Edward Leach, I love that name, isn't it, was the treasurer. He had to appoint him with the name of that. And he estimated the building cost was £2,200. How wrong was he? We're not unaccustomed to building costs soaring, are we? Now, if we just compare that with the modern costs, we had a refurbishment a few years ago, and we built out at the front and put the lift in. We didn't build a whole new chapel, but including the fit-out, I think that was about £1.7 million. So just think, actually, in Victorian money, how much the cost of the chapel was to be, and anything above that was going to be a real disaster. And also they needed to be able to afford to pay the ground rent and pay their minister Llewellyn. So how much did they, by the time they built the chapel, have pledged? Because remember, they'd all done this on the Never Never on loans. Well, they had £376, including Frank Spence's £100. So they only had 19%. Ouch. So the treasurer said, all members having been taxed to the utmost, I hope that most friends belonging to other denominations will come forward and assist us through the means of collecting books with which I'll be very happy to supply them. So he was actually saying, please, we need help from, actually, Bowden Downs Congregational Church, the rich mill owners and merchants who live in Bowden because we haven't got any money. And the congregation of Altrincham Baptist was primarily, because I tracked quite a few of these through, servants, tradespeople, and working class people generally. So there we are. So how did they pay? Well, the answer is they couldn't pay. The only way they actually had a cost overrun of £300. And then Frank Spence left. He was relocated. They actually moved to get closer to the business. So they got a private mortgage in 1879 from a guy called Thomas Thompson from Bowden Downs Congregational Church. And they had a £1,000 interest-free loan from the Baptist Union. Sorry, £100. Sorry, I can't read my own writing there. Anyway, it was a loan, wasn't it? Yes. A small loan by comparison. And they actually had to refinance shortly afterwards, because Thomas Thompson was dying and they thought actually their loan would be called in. So they refinanced with Star Life at 4.2% for £1,200. So it was actually really tricky financially. I mean, when we did our refurbishment here, we basically made sure most of the money was in before we did anything. But they built the chapel, so there it is. That's the best one of the outside with the tower, which was later demolished due to a slight problem with pigeon droppings, but we won't go too much into that. It was unstable. So what was the name of this new chapel on Hale Road? I'm going to ask you again. Was it Hale Road Baptist, Bowden Baptist, Altrincham Baptist, or the Tabernacle Altrincham? So let's see who gets this. Hale Road Baptist. We've got one. Bowden Baptist. We've got a couple. Altrincham Baptist. We've got a few there. And the Tabernacle Altrincham. Ooh, a couple there. Right. Well, some of these are red herrings. I'm sorry about this. But interestingly enough, they still call themselves Bowden Baptist. Can you imagine? Because they're not in Bowden, but it's still called Bowden Baptist. So they moved in, and the first service was held on 12th October 1879. It was devotional only. And then they had a public opening the next Tuesday to raise funds, and they raised £21. Going well. And guess who spoke? Alexander MacLaren? Absolutely. Because he really invested a lot, not financially, but a lot in making this work well. And they held a fundraising bazaar on the 16th of October. Victorian churches often did this. They would have bazaars and they'd bring things to sell and buy and so on. Actually, they raised a lot of money and they'd have a tea party and all those sort of things. But obviously, being a good Baptist church, no gambling, lottery or alcohol. But then one or two bombshells are going to come later on in this talk. The first one is Llewellyn then announced he was leaving. And he had a 1-year-old daughter, but she unfortunately had mental health problems, and I think he was struggling to cope, reading between the lines. They had a son who was born in 1880. So his farewell service was on the 30th of January 1881, and he retired to Urmston and died in 1936. And there are hints he really did have some form of breakdown, but he stayed in touch with the church. He was very popular and regularly came back to preach. I suspect the building project really got to him, because the church was struggling. So Henry Mowbray was the new minister they got in, and I'm going to ask you a question. Is he the worst senior pastor of the Baptists in Altrincham, or is he simply misunderstood and the best he could in the circumstances? Now, the history that's been written will tell you the former, and he didn't get a good press in Altrincham until later on, but I'm going to try and tell you the opposite. I'm going to say, actually, he was a good guy, but under very difficult circumstances. So we're actually going to go for but you can decide at the end of this. I'm going to give you the facts. So here he is, quite a dapper-looking guy. He came to faith, interestingly enough, through Canon Wainwright, who was the vicar of St. John's Church up the road, and which is quite a close link. And I think that's one of the reasons he was attracted to come to Altrincham, the challenges here. His family home was in Neston in the Wirral, and he was educated in Liverpool, so he was actually a Liverpudlian. He married Jessie when he was 29, and she was 21, and they had one son called Robert. And it was obvious he was going to be asked to speak, so he came to the church anniversary on Thursday, the 27th of January 1881. Now, you notice there's this odd, interesting discrepancy in dates, but we'll think about that later. And he was on the platform, and the Sunday before Llewellyn had left. So he was then due to speak for the next 2 Sundays. They had a church meeting, and the church secretary burst into the meeting and bemoaned the finances. He wasn't supposed to be there. He just ran in saying, it's a disaster, basically. We haven't got any assistance available from the Lancashire and Cheshire Baptist Association. We're in dispute with the builder, surprise, surprise, over extras. That's what often happens, isn't it? And Mowbray, with all this going on, began his ministry in July 1881, and he was paid £120 a year. And they moved into 76 Hale Road. He wasn't theologically trained, which is not unusual at the time. Nowadays you expect ministers to be trained, but actually most weren't, which is why Spurgeon set up his college to begin to train ministers. So he was effectively what we would call a lay pastor. But the church grew, and they paid off £400. But it wasn't enough, and they reduced Mowbray's pay, and then they found sometimes they couldn't pay him. So he was actually in financial difficult straits, and he went into debt. And he had a young family, obviously, to bring up. So this was really difficult. And then we come to a fateful church meeting. In 1881, the Altrincham Congregational Church had closed. So it wasn't just this church that had real financial troubles. In March 1887, there was what's called the downgrade article, first downgrade article, and it was not long before this church meeting. Now, this was quite relevant to what happened, but not the actual main cause of what happened. But Spurgeon had been uncomfortable with the way he thought the Baptist churches were going, the Baptist Union was going. He thought they were going like on the downgrade theologically, on a railway line, and going to come off the rails at built-up speed and would come crashing off. And he started publishing a series of articles. The author was anonymous, but everyone knew Spurgeon, in his magazine, really saying the Baptist Union's got to come back on track. And clearly there was a threat he would leave the Baptist Union. This caused a huge controversy at the time. And anyway, Mowbray then in March 1887, he brought an explosive proposal to the church meeting. And what he said was, well, first of all, the deacons were split, so he came and said, we can't agree. And let's just remember he'd been a businessman when he brought this proposal. So the proposal was he knew the church couldn't afford him or its debts, so his solution was to sell this chapel and to rent somewhere. Okay? His solution was to sell. Now imagine you're in that church meeting. Minister stands up and says, we're going to sell. And interestingly enough, it was a special church meeting, which means he had to have a 2/3 majority because that was in the trust deeds. What the church trust deeds didn't allow was proxy voting, a special church meeting, but they allowed it at ordinary church meetings. And that caused him huge headaches because people would not turn up to church, not turn up to the meeting and just send someone stand and say, I've got 20 proxy votes here, which interestingly enough is why a certain church secretary, when we redid our church constitution, said, no, we're not having proxy votes. You've got to be there in person. And the result of the meeting, I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger here because we're breaking for tea. About 5 minutes if we can. Here we go. Right. So, Minister Henry Moby brings his proposal, which was to sell this building. Who thinks he won the vote? Who thinks they decided not to sell the building? Correct. Well, that's right. Because he didn't get it. So, in fact, he got 2/3, probably, he didn't get his 2/3, I think he got about 60%. And he announced he was resigning in May. He'd had enough, he hadn't got his way. So, what happened to Mowbray after that? Well, his next move was he started services in a new Baptist chapel and building society rooms on Market Street, probably the next Sunday after he left, certainly the Sunday after that. So, the building society rooms were actually a penny bank, and they're where the old hospital was on Market Street. And he announced in the local paper, 10:30 a.m. and 6 p.m, all seats free, no collection. And I think the idea of that was, I'm not after your money. Please come along, particularly if you're at Hale Row Baptist Church or Chapel, because we are after a real new start here. We're not going to be financially burdened. So the new church, and he held a meeting on 19th April 1887 at the British School off Oxford Road. Remember where we saw that? That was where he held his first meeting to start the new church. That was the first church meeting. And 62 people left here to follow him, and about 40 stayed. Okay? Remember, the congregation had dwindled a bit due to the financial problems. Interestingly enough, 17 men left and 45 women. So it was very much the women, I think, of the church who were driving to leave to follow the minister. And the first hymn they sang or song was "Oh Happy Day," which we sang, if you remember. And not to the tune you all know. It's not... Oh, right. It was not to the tune that we now sing, the gospel one. It was a much older tune. And he wrote a letter to the local newspaper about this and basically said, "I've done my best, but we just haven't been able to make a go of it. So we're starting a new church for an honest endeavour, effectively." So what was the name of this new church? Here we go again. Who thinks it was Hale Road Baptist Church? Who thinks it was the Tabernacle Altrincham? Who thinks it was Altrincham Baptist Church? And who thinks it was Market Street Baptist? Okay, I'm sorry to keep on asking. It's quite fun, just keeps your interest, you know. But actually, it was Altrincham Baptist Church. So, this is the shock. We are the successors to the church that walked out and left the building here. That's a bit of a surprise, isn't it? There were negotiations, because this was a scandal, to try and reunite the two churches, and McLaren became personally involved. As I said, I think that although the rift was about money, actually there was also a bit of a theological divide developing, which was due to the downgrade controversy, and Mowbray would have been on the side of Spurgeon in saying, look, things are going off the rails theologically, and taking, I suppose, what we nowadays call a more conservative view. Remember that Spurgeon's congregation was about 10,000 people. 10,000 people each Sunday came into his Metropolitan Tabernacle in London, and he too had a worldwide influence, probably greater than McLaren's. He too had his sermons published every Sunday. And the next thing to happen was that Spurgeon left the Baptist Union, and McLaren was involved in shuttle diplomacy to bring him back and Altrincham Baptist back here. So he actually did the two jobs. He was trying to deal with both and actually trying to negotiate both. And it shows actually how important he regarded the church here, because it was like a flagship church that was his personal project almost. And there's a family called the Brewer family. And I remember Bill Brewer was in our house group when I first moved here. And a lovely bloke. And they've got a very interesting history. I tracked down some of the descendants of the family, a fantastic story there. And they split into two and going different ways with the two churches. Then from one Mowbray's point of view, one problem was that one deacon went back to Hale Road. And the Hale Road church secretary refused to note any resignations except Mowbray. So that was a bit tactless, but there we are. There was no reconciliation, however, and therefore Altrincham Baptist Church went it alone. And Mowbray took no pay, what we now call, then was called a stipend, and he went to work in Manchester to support himself, because he basically said, you can't afford me, but I'll still be your minister, and I'm going to work in Manchester as a businessman. Bowden Baptist Church carried on, and it was supported by the Baptist Union because they had to. Because interestingly enough, Altrincham Baptist Church was not a member of the Baptist Union. Henry Leonard became the minister in 1888, and guess who preached at his induction? McLaren. But Spurgeon had a secret list of ministers who he said, Baptist ministers who were on the downgrade, who were going theologically off the rails. And fairly recently, scholars have actually found, they think, that handwritten note. And guess whose name is on the note? Yes, the minister of Bowden Baptist Church, Henry Leonard, was named by Spurgeon's. And I think that is symbolised by the fact that they had a meeting. I've come across the records in Altrincham. And a guy called Charles Bradley was the speaker, and he was a well-known atheist. And bizarrely, Henry Leonard appeared on the platform. He's noted in the minutes of the meeting and in the newspaper. He didn't say anything, but it's a really weird thing to do. Maybe he was just supporting free speech. Now, Henry Mowbray immediately spotted an advantage here. So what did he do? He organised a mission at the same time. an evangelistic mission. And who did he get in? Well, Charles Brother had a younger brother who was a Christian. So he had speeches at the same time. One was by the atheist and one was the Christian as part of the Altrincham Baptist Church mission. But going back, continuing with Bowden Baptist Church here, in 1890, Henry Leonard was succeeded by a guy called William Perkins, and that was more on an informal basis. He was parachuted in to they call supply the pulpit to preach from McLaren's Union Chapel. So, Altrincham Baptist Church, they discovered that on 22nd February 1888, the building society on Market Street, which had taken everyone's penny bank savings, had gone bust. So, Mowbray found a new location, and he took a lease of £30 from the railway company, and he found £300 to build the new building. Now, just think about that. He was in debt, so where's he got £300 from? Which we'll come back to in a second. He took the lease in his own name, and he was going to rent it back to the church, this property, for a fairly cheap sum and take no pay. So how was he doing this? Well, I want to just bring in someone else who's got an interesting connection, two brothers who've got an interesting connection with this church. And the first one is a guy called Frank Crossley. And he was a friend of both Mowbray and McLaren. And I think he's the guy who gave or lent the £300 to Mowbray. I just want to tell you very quickly about him. He could have a book on his own, and in fact one day I'd like to write one. And he lived locally, and he's the most amazing man. He was a really committed Christian, but he was a billionaire of his time, extremely rich. He and his brother owned a company called Crossley Engineering. And if you go around the Museum of Science and Industry, you'll see their engines, and they had produced buses later on and all sorts of that sort of thing. So have a look for Crossley Engineering as well in the Steam Hall. You can see some elsewhere. And they were both owned at time managing directors, joint managing directors, and they made a lot of money out of this. And later the company was taken over and became part of Rolls-Royce. And as a committed Christian, he really was uncomfortable with being well off. So one day he decided that what he'd do, he and his wife, they would pour all their wines down the drain. They had a really expensive collection. They lived at a place called Fairley, which is now part of Altrincham Girls' Grammar School. It's one of the houses which forms part of the school. And they then decided basically to sell their house and give all their art collections to the Whitworth Art Gallery. It's still there. And moved. They kept a house in Derbyshire because his health really suffered from, because their factories were in Encoats, from just the poor atmosphere there. But they gave everything else away, all the jewellery. He kept a pocket watch, that was it. And they moved into a very small house with their family in Encoats, which was the roughest part of Manchester. And they bought a mission hall next to this house. But it wasn't a mission hall, it was actually a disused theatre, and turned it into a mission hall and looked after the poor and gave them clothing and food and things, and also used it as a mission base. And then he'd go off and do his job in the factory as managing director. It's an amazing story. There's lots more about him, but he was quite influential in this area. So I think he was the guy, because he was a friend, but he had to do it discreetly, so this was very discreet funding. And you can tell because, interestingly enough, guess what? He turned up at the first service, didn't say anything of Altrincham Baptist Church in the new building. And as I say, he was a friend of McLaren, so he couldn't do anything publicly, but he was a friend of Mowbray, so he wanted to help. And he would have liked the idea of this new start, evangelistic chapel. So where was this new building that Altrincham Baptist Church moved to? Well, let's go back to that photograph. And remember I showed you before of Railway Street. And if you look, there's a little building on the right, and I'm going to zoom in on that. Can you see that building there? Now, local historians have said before that that was part of as a ticket office for the railway station, but it wasn't. It was actually the first Altrincham Baptist Church building, and there it is. right by where what we call Toast now. The reason the horse cabs are there and taxi cabs was because they carried on that as a taxi rank, even though the station had finished being a station. So that was where we started, effectively after the Building Society rooms. So what was this chapel that they built for only £300? Well, it was a flat pack chapel. You could actually buy chapels. It was made of iron, and guess what? They called it the Tabernacle Altrincham. So those of you who've mentioned the Tabernacle, although the church was Altrincham Baptist Church, it was called the Tabernacle Altrincham. And I think the reason is partly because there was the Tabernacle movement which made these. It might have been a nod to Toxteth Tabernacle, where Mowbray was at before, and it's all in Liverpool. It also might be a nod to Spurgeon, of course, because his church was the Metropolitan Tabernacle. So I found an advert in a paper for buying a flat pack chapel. There's a picture of one. There's one apparently in Trafford Park somewhere. So that's the first chapel. That's the only picture we have. I've just showed you of it. And the style of church, well, its local nickname was, they didn't call it the Tabernacle, they called it the Iron Tabernacle, the locals in Altrincham, and it was a real contrast to Hale Road. So they went back to having open-air services round the big lamp on Railway Street. They had a portable organ, so they could do that. They bought one. They almost immediately had two missions. They had testimony meetings. They appointed a guy called Nankervell, who was from Cornwall, as a full-time evangelist. So Mowbray didn't take any pay, but they paid for someone, and he was from the Church of England, actually, they took on. And it was really a gospel and mission hall, very much preaching the Bible, that sort of revivalist feeling, and the church grew. But then, in 1892, another bombshell happened. So, what is this? Well, Hale Road Church folded. Perkins was parachuted in, but he only lasted for 3 months, and they handed back the keys to the trustees. And Mowbray, ever the opportunist, bought it back for £850. Now, remember, the building costs were over £2,850. That was quite a good deal. And Altrincham Baptist Church marched through the streets on the evening of 21st May 1892 to formally collect the keys and hold a service here. And the new trustees were Mowbray, plus people from Bowden Downs Congregation Church, quite interesting, because they were prepared to give support to the breakaway church, effectively, to try and help it. And ABC then rejoined the Baptist Union, because, of course, it was difficult for it to be in the Baptist Union when there were two competing Baptist churches. But there was also a behind-the-scenes deal. So the idea was that Mowbray was the pastor, carried on there, and guess who chaired the reconciliation meeting? Frank Crossley. He could now come into the public eye, couldn't he? And there was a final emotional service at the Tabernacle. And unfortunately, the Mowbray said, please would everyone who wants to take photographs, take them. So they took photographs, and there are none. I've tried to trace the Mowbray family. I can't find them. He then organised a mission, which was led by a singing evangelist called Mr. Cairns from Chicago. So he was very keen on missions, as you can understand. Nankervell then left. And interesting enough, as he left, he said that churches shouldn't have nice concerts but missions. And I think that was a dig at Bowden Baptist Church, the way it had started to go. But some Hale Road members refused to rejoin whilst Mowbray was there, because they were still very upset about what had happened, as you can imagine. And try and judge Mowbray, because I think he really did his best, because he was in an impossible situation when he didn't get the vote. But there we are. So Mowbray, the deal was he would become joint senior pastor. And after a decent period, he would resign and would be given a post as a missionary elsewhere. And guess who gave him that post? William Crossley, the brother of Frank Crossley. Interestingly enough, William Crossley's name is on one of our memorial stones at the back. So have a look later on as you go outside. So that was the deal, and Mowbray agreed to that because it was to save face for everyone, to give us decent handover time whilst they got a new minister in, for people not to really realise there was something, a deal, it was behind-the-scenes deal with the deacons and Mowbray. There, interestingly enough, is an old photograph of the memorial stones with the people who put them there. You'll recognise the guy later on the right. And the lady on the left we don't know much about, and the gentleman in the middle was William Crossley. They buried time capsules behind those, and some of you probably remember we put in new time capsules when we did the refurb. So the new minister. So was Henry Mowbray a good buy or not? I'll leave you to decide. So who was this new minister to be to reunite the church, to bring two churches together, pay off the debt and grow the combined church? Before we do that, I just want to do a little sidestep, but it's also relevant to here. I want to talk about a church plant. Now, remember that Mowbray was a friend of Wainwright, Reverend Canon Wainwright from St John's Church. And St John's Church was a church plant of Bowden Church, and it was for working class people. I've actually done the history of St John's Church. I've done a talk about that if you ever want one. That's quite an interesting one as well. In fact, they had quite a lot in common with the nonconformist churches. And St John's itself planted a church called St Elizabeth's. Guess who purchased the houses to plant the mission church? Well, William Crossley. It was in the poorest area of Altrincham, and it was called Calais, nicknamed Calais. And it was effectively a gated community controlled by the police to keep the people in. Well, where was it? Actually, it's where Sainsbury's car park and Sainsbury's are now, and also the social housing, which is Lloyd's Gardens, all that sort of area, and going a bit further round. And they actually had a barrier controlled by the police, roughly where the entrance coming in towards Sainsbury's is, so you could stop people going in and out and just check that, they were not out to do anything nefarious. So that was Altrincham at the time. So they planted a mission church there. And that's a picture of it inside, called St Elizabeth's. There it is outside, long since demolished, of course. And there is the school that went with it, I think demolished in the 60s. And there it is. And the site is there, can you see, by the railway? Calais stretches all the way around there, basically, and all the way up there. No one knows why it's called Calais. There are different theories, by the way. And guess what's there? Anyone recognise it? Where St Elizabeth was? It's the hub. Isn't that a nice little connection there going back in history? So back to Hale Road. So they had to appoint a new joint senior pastor. And the senior pastor was Frederick Cowell Lloyd, who was called on the 1st of February 1893. And leaving any ministers out of the last 30 years for tact, or 50 years, any one of the last 50 years, he was definitely the greatest minister of this church, as you'll see. But he had a huge task. His grandfather was a missionary in Jamaica with William Knibb. Now, you'll see that's very influential on him. A lot of people say Wilberforce. Do you remember they stopped the slave trade, and that was a sort of nonconformist move with people from the Church of England? But actually, people don't realise that didn't stop slavery. Slavery just carried on in the British Empire as before. And the biggest slave place was in Jamaica, with the sugar plantations. And what we should be proud of, it was actually the Baptist missionaries, led by William Knibb in Jamaica, who campaigned to stop slavery in the British Empire and came back to England to lobby Parliament and created a big fuss. And in fact, one of the big things that William Knibb did, which got him a lot of publicity, was one of the deacons in his church was a slave, and he appointed him as deacon, which was hugely controversial. It was a Baptist church. And this guy was then arrested for being in a prayer meeting and praying too loudly. So they came in, arrested him, and sentenced him for breaching the peace to be lashed. And Knibb then insisted on standing next to him and wanted to be chained as well, because they wouldn't do it. And then he wrote to the newspapers in England and said, this is what these people are doing over here. And actually that was the start of the movement to actually stop slavery, and eventually they were successful. But remember that our minister here, his grandfather, was one of those Baptist missionaries. So Cowell Lloyd, the grandson, started as a teacher, and he was a star pupil at Regent's Park College, which was a theological college in Regent's Park in London, later moved to Oxford. And they deliberately took, and I'm sure McLaren chose him because he was the top pupil. He married a lady called Alice Green, not long before he came to Altrincham, but sadly she died young. There used to be a plaque to her whilst he was here. And he later married another lady called Louis, whilst he was here, and she was profoundly deaf. But that was his marriage situation. And he was aged 27 when he came here, and Mowbray was 45. Now, I've got a picture of Cowell Lloyd as a student. So here we are. He's got a big beard, hasn't he? I'm going to give you another one now, which is later in life when he's a bit more sensible. But when he came here, he was sort of the radical student. And there was a transfer of power because Lloyd was paid, but Mowbray carried on supporting himself. And Mowbray had agreed with McLaren he would leave, but then he turned round and said, but I want you to cement the deal because I want you, the Lancashire Baptist, to pay £80 for 2 years to Altrincham Baptist Church to keep the funding going. And he didn't leave until the money arrived. So then he left. And so I think his heart was really in the church. And he left in January 1895. He died in 1927. I tracked him down. He became a police missionary in London, then was minister of a church in Barnet in London. But the debt was now down, obviously, to £700, helped by buying the chapel back at a cheap price, but they'd had to take on debt to do that. The church remained Altrincham Baptist Church, but they actually fudged it after that to sort of pretend there hadn't been a split. So they started calling it Hell Road Baptist Church. And certainly in my time, David Thompson will correct me, we used to make cheques out to Hell Road Baptist. But it was also Altrincham Baptist, so he's not sure, but I certainly seem to remember that. But anyway, there was a sort of bringing together of the names. And Cowell Lloyd went and knocked on people's doors to get the money. He just went out and knocked, said, give us some money, please, particularly for the rich people in Bowden. He set up bazaars, and he wrote a booklet called How We Paid the Debt. He cleared it off in 1 year. Basically, he was just like a whirlwind. Now, sadly, that book has been lost. I've got a copy of the front page of it. I can't track it down anywhere. And the reason for that is that a previous minister who I won't name here threw all the church records into the tip. And fortunately, one of Sheila's predecessors at the time realised this wasn't a good thing and actually managed to retrieve in the rain from the skip outside. But unfortunately, we lost some historic books and we lost How We Paid the Debt because he was definitely in the church library. So if anyone can find it for me, I've looked on all the libraries I can think of. But it's amazing, he paid everything off in a year. And in fact, McLaren was so impressed that they asked him to speak and publish the booklet because this caused a sensation in the Baptist churches because it showed you could actually pay off your debt because a lot of Baptist churches were in debt. They tried even to pay off the ground rent, but by the time they'd raised the money, they were outbid at the auction. They hadn't quite got enough together. Interestingly enough, and again, I think David will remember this, I recommended you remember we should buy the ground rent, which by then was still there, but actually wasn't that much, and we bought it, and we bought out effectively all the old covenants in the lease, including, dare I say, the one which prohibited the sale of alcohol, but we'll move on from that. So we finally did that, and the people who actually sold it to us said, it's been a long time, hasn't it, if you remember? But there was a huge growth in numbers. He was a fantastic preacher, great reputation. He knew every member of the congregation and their address by heart. He made over 1,000 personal visits a year. Now, we do things differently these days, but that's what he did, and he was just very energetic. He spotted new attenders and arranged for them to be spotted as soon as they came into church, and talked to and helped. He had a mission each year with a top evangelist. He got really good people in. And they had duties for church members, and every member mission was duty number 7. He was very good at publicity and the press, so he was always writing to the local newspapers about things. Good PR, and he knocked on doors generally. He was very keen on prayer and committed to prayer. And the Sunday school was a key part of the evangelism for the church, because by 1898 there were 308 pupils. It was a slightly wider range now in age than we have. But not all of them came to church, so it was a great sort of mission field. So they'd have services where they would invite the parents along to hear the children doing something. And that's how it worked for them. So just a portrait of this guy. He was politically active, as we'll see. He was a liberal. Now, when I did my last talk, I was challenged to say what liberal means. It's in America in particular, it's got a bit of a bad name these days, but actually the nonconformist tradition is actually following on really very much aligned with the Liberal Party. And I read Tim Farron's book recently, which is quite interesting on his comments about that and reminding the Liberal Party that actually its roots come from these nonconformist ideas. So it would have been quite normal for that, but liberal doesn't mean what it means in America now. It's a bad word. It means all these things of toleration, really helping the poor, freedom of speech, that sort of thing, freedom of religion, all these great values which are actually often taken for granted. He was against modern-day slavery. We think, where's that? Because by then they'd abolished slavery in the British Empire. But there was a time around his time, when the British Empire took Chinese people into South Africa and coerced them to go there. And it was a sort of slavery. So he campaigned in the press with lots of other people to stop this. British imperialism at its worst, I think he was basically said. He was highly active. The church was a particular Baptist church, interestingly enough. So there were two types of Baptist churches, general in particular. I won't get into the theological differences there. No one disliked him. There's not a bad word said about him by anyone. And what he did also was try to create an alternative society, like a lot of Baptist churches and nonconformist churches. So they had meetings and things to try and educate people and just help people understand things better. And so he was a good preacher. And he was prepared to work with other denominations in Altrincham, and even the Anglicans, because a lot about nonconformists say, I can't go with them, but he actually worked with Anglican churches, particularly St. John's. He was against the Boer War, because again he disagreed with what was going on there, but he supported anyone who decided to fight there. And in fact, there was a difficult decision for him, because one of the church members, called Trelfer, actually went out and fought in the Boer, came back and had an accident at nurseries off Hale Road, and fell off the roof and died. And at the funeral, it was quite difficult. I don't think Cowell Lloyd wanted a military funeral, but there was a military funeral, so he wanted to support, so he still went along. Strongly defended freedom of religion. He was teetotal, so he was against the selling of Sunday alcohol, but never got that. He was very against the opium trafficking trade, which the British Empire supported in China. And he was almost certainly in favour of Home Rule for Ireland. There were some very interesting debates at the British School between the two sides, which I'm pretty sure he would have attended at the time. That's another whole different topic there. So why did he try to go to prison? Because remember I said one of the ministers here tried to go to prison? Well, it was about education. Many nonconformists had to go to Anglican schools. But in fact, the local school that they would have gone to mostly would have been the British school. That was the nonconformist school, but they couldn't fit in everyone, so some would go to Anglican schools. And they had to pay, under the Education Acts that came in, Conservative government brought them in, through the rates for Anglican and Catholic schools, but their own schools, which are closed down, the Methodist and nonconformist churches, were closed down by the government. And so, interestingly enough, the churches that were built for the schools that were built for the nonconformists were Navigation Road and Stamford Park for the nonconformist children. So that's where the Baptist children would have gone when the British school was closed down. But this caused a huge fuss because why should they pay? The idea originally was to close down the Anglican and Catholic schools as well, and then they really let down on this deliberately by the government at the time. And so they said, we don't want to pay our rates. Why should we support schools through the rates when our schools are being closed down? It's just not fair. So McKennell from the Congregational Church, he led a deputation to Parliament. In May 1903, 140,000 people demonstrated in Hyde Park. But their dilemma was how to protest. Should be active or passive resistance or just peaceful protest. And the lady called Isabel Mills of Bowden Downs Congregational, who wrote a pamphlet about this, and she came out in favour of some form of passive protesting about this, because they didn't want to break the law, but they wanted to do something which was a bit more radical, and there was a huge split in Altrincham about that at the time. The issue really was equality under the law and the discrimination against the nonconformists. Armitage, Lloyd, McKennell, Mills, they all came together. All the nonconformist churches were against this, including the Methodists. But McKennell opposed any form of resistance. He just said we should protest peacefully. Lloyd then had a meeting here and said, no, we need to do something more dramatic. So he won the day locally because people generally, the nonconformists generally in Altrincham and Sale, supported him. And this was, by the way, a national thing that happened with the protests going on. It was a big issue at the time. And interesting enough, by the way, one of the deals for the Education Acts was that you would still have prayers and Christian assemblies in schools, which is why that has carried on. So leading nonconformists refused to pay their rates. So it was a sort of passive protest. And the Baptists here were the main organisers for the area. The courts were packed with protesters because what happened was that they were taken to court for failure to pay their rates, and an order of distraint was made against their goods. So the bailiffs would then come in and sell their goods. And they were taken to Sale magistrates there, and things were auctioned. And the first auction, people in the streets walked around with placards, and the auction was held at J. Percival and Co. in Market Street. And that's actually... It's a law firm on the left as you go down Market Street. And what happened was, there was a brilliant record of the local papers when they say, people just stormed in because they were allowed to attend the auction, and they sang hymns whilst the auction was taking place. And then what they did was they bought back the people who did not pay their rates. They bought all their goods and then just gave them back to them. So it was a sort of passive resistance to make a point about this. So I think it's quite an interesting stance that they made. Jesse Howarth was a magistrate at Sale, and he refused to pay. Interestingly enough, he was one of the main funders of Egyptology, and but for him we wouldn't have all the Egyptian stuff at Manchester Museum. And they called themselves passive resistors. And interestingly enough, I think that this was something that was picked up when we had Gandhi, because he was in South Africa and then India, and they were passive resistors. This was international news. And I just have a theory that he picked up his idea of passive resistance from what was going on here with the nonconformists. So there was a couple of people who actually went to prison in Knutsford because they refused to pay their rates, and they persuaded people not to go and buy their goods back, and they went in style and took a first-class ticket, wanted a top hat, and went to prison in Knutsford for a week. So one was Robert Lewis, the other one was Edwin Holt, who was a local solicitor. His firm, until recently, certainly still existed. And some of the ministers went to the court in Sale, including Cowell Lloyd, a Congregational minister, and a Primitive Methodist minister. So he was there, and he made a speech pleading the Toleration Act and saying, this is unconstitutional. It's in the local newspapers. The court was packed. And basically, there was a restraint order made against his goods, and he was going to go to prison unless this was paid off. So he came out, but in fact what happened was the court then announced that actually he's just been paid, all the money, his debt has been paid. What had happened was the church congregation had clubbed together behind his back and paid the money. So there's a fantastic meeting where he comes out onto the bridge at Sale, you know where the tram stop is, and holds a public meeting with the newspapers there and says basically, why have you Baptist Church congregation, my congregation, stopped me going to prison? I wanted to go to prison. Please don't do it again. But he never succeeded. He didn't actually go to prison. And what happened in the end, unfortunately, they just couldn't overturn what was happening in Parliament. So all the protests just came to nothing, and all the legislation went through. The rates continued to be paid, etc. Just looking briefly at how they worshipped. Bowden Downs Congregational Chapel had, so their organist was Isabel Mills' husband called John Mills. And in fact, he was loaned to the chapel, Altrincham Baptist for a while. The Betts family, do you remember them at Downs Chapel? They were like a singing family Von Trapp because they had lots of children and they all sang. So they led the singing. A lot of it might have been unaccompanied, but they had a harmonium. And we'll come on to that later, but that was played by Sidney Brookfield, who again was on loan from Bowden Downs Congregational. There's his building. He was actually a general draper, hosier, glover, and in fact, you remember that photograph we showed of Railway Street? It's taken, I think, from that building. It's still there. It's not now a shop or anything. And do you remember we looked at that photograph of the early church? Oops, sorry. And they have the harmonium on the platform. That's it. So that's all they had, really. And we know that there was a harmonium bought by Altrincham Baptist Church when it started. And there's the organ, of course, that came in 1908. So how they worshipped? Well, they had a choir regularly. They were actually, Altrincham Baptist Church with Mowbray was very much a gospel church, and they sang the latest songs. The Moody and Sankey songs, which was like, do you remember we used to have Mission Praise, or nowadays we have the latest on screen? They were actually genuinely singing the latest songs. And of course we know that they held outdoor services. And there we are, just a reminder of that again. I want to touch briefly on alcohol and temperance. The temperance movement started in Preston and then changed to become teetotal. The difference, temperance was you could have wine but not spirits. And it was almost universally adopted in both guises by the nonconformists, with some Anglicans supporting. McKennell at Bowden Downs was in a difficult position, so he never committed either way because his brother was a salesman in the brewing trade. But it was a real social issue in Altrincham. If you think there are problems now, you should have seen the number of pubs there were and the number of drunks there were around. There were protests on the streets in Altrincham against relaxing the licensing laws. And actually, the local MP was Coningsby Disraeli, who was related to the famous Disraeli. He was the Conservative MP. And he was opposed by William Crossley, who eventually became the first Liberal MP for Altrincham. So, as I said, they tried to create an alternative society so that people didn't get drunk. There was no temptation to go back on alcohol. Thomas Cook was a Baptist, and he was part of this. His first railway excursion was in 1841, and he was creating this alternative society. They had self-improvement societies in Altrincham. And what happened was that as people stopped drinking, their wealth increased. They weren't pouring it down the drain effectively. They had pleasant Sunday afternoon societies where they would talk about current things. They even had an old temperance pub, it was called. And if you look on the left, there's a building there, and ironically, guess what's there now? Yes, it's Wetherspoon's pub. And there was a road down to the left, which was called Temperance Terrace. And the building, you see the triangular building there on the corner, which is now my optometrist's, that was actually a working men's club where they sold non-alcoholic drinks and they gave lectures upstairs to working class people. It was basically a teetotal pub. Just a quick look at marriage, coming towards the end now. Remember that the church gradually rose from working class to more to middle class. And I just want to look at one particular marriage. You can't see it very well, but that's in a building just off Regent Road. It no longer exists, unfortunately. And we're just looking quickly. If you zoom in, on the left is Cowell Lloyd. There he is, and at the top right there, who's later. There he is with his deacons, but he was at this particular wedding. So there we are, he's at the back right. And this was a marriage between someone from this church, who was a deacon, and someone from a lady from Bowden Downs Congregational. And the father of the groom is Charles Frederick Southwell Senior. You can just see him sitting down at the top left. And I traced the family, which is why I found all these photographs. He was a joiner. His family moved into the area from emails. And as I say, he was the father of the groom, who was called Charles Frederick Southwell Jr., just to confuse everyone. And there he is. But there's Jacob Boland, who's the father of the bride. He was at Bowden Downs Congregational. And there's a picture of him in the centre, can you see? And he is in the Bowden Working Men's Temperance Group. And you can tell the working men by their boots. Those who've got boots where you can see they're pretty working class, then they're the working men. The other people are the richer people who turned up and helped. So Jacob Boland, his father was a gardener. He himself had a decorating business, and he was elected to the West Ward locally in Altrincham in 1897 as a Liberal. Surprise, surprise. And that's an older photograph. Do you recognise the building? That was where he was based. That was his decorating business and outlet. And the house that he lived in was there, I think. And there he is. This is an early Liberal Party cart, and there's a dog on top. You can see if you zoom in, it's quite sweet, and there's a dog down there. There's Jacob Boland. And there is Frederick Charles Southwell Jr., so obviously supporting his father-in-law at that stage, and vote for Jacob. Jacob's Ladder, they called it. It's to do with his painting business. And there's the happy couple in the front, Charles and his wife, Annie. There's Annie. And that's the wedding photograph for them. Annie Boland. But she's an interesting character because she came to Altrincham Baptist Church when they got married. And she was a suffragette. So that's one of the questions I asked before. You remember that actually, you have to remember that a lot of suffragettes, I think, were from a nonconformist background. But they were more likely to be suffragists because the suffragettes actually believed in some violence. The suffragists didn't. But the Pankhursts were a former Baptist family, and the children were brought up as Baptists. And remember that women could vote in chapels, in nonconformist chapels, and I think that led them to the conclusion, why can't we vote in society? We can vote for the minister at a Baptist church or congregational church. Why can't we, or Presbyterian? It's not right that it should happen elsewhere. Charles Frederick Southwell Jr. was a deacon here. He was an artist and designer working for the mayor, George Faulkner Armitage, who was a leading nonconformist in the area, and another Liberal. So she's the only suffragette we know of here, but I suspect that others would have suffragist sympathies. But then an interesting thing happened to the church to do with the Holy Spirit. Have you heard of the Welsh Revival? So the church was growing, but also remember that Lloyd, he's got a Welsh name, and the Keswick Convention started meeting, and they had an outlet in Wales, and this led to 1904. Florrie Evans was a teenager, and she just declared in a prayer meeting, I love the Lord Jesus with all of my heart. She's down at the bottom there. And people were really moved by this, moved to tears quite literally. And it just started a rival that swept through the whole of Wales. Evan Roberts was a 26-year-old miner who received what he called a fresh baptism of the Spirit. That's him there. And they had real prayer and revival. One of the famous songs from it is Here Is Love, Fast as the Ocean, which we still sing today. And something happened to Cowell Lloyd. He went on a summer holiday in 1904 and returned, and I think he went to Wales, a changed man. And beginning in October 1904, his sermons in the mornings were exclusively on the Holy Spirit. He said this would result in a glorious outflow of evangelistic enthusiasm and irresistible power. There are few more important topics, and yet there are few less intelligently dealt with, nor more vaguely comprehended, yet not by my might, but by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord. But then he announced he was leaving. He did his sermon series and he was going. Oh dear, what do they do next? Well, he was persuaded to stay. And what happened was they had a public campaign, and the deacons wrote to the newspapers, they had public meetings, got everyone involved locally, they had petitions, and then they had a big meeting here, and he said he was going to announce his decision at the meeting, so they had the press in and everyone hoping he was staying. And then he sat through the first bit and said, I'm sorry, I've got to tell you, it's not fair to keep you in holding on. But he said, the chief reason I'm staying is the appeal of the children who had all written a petition to him and the conversions which have recently taken place through which he recognised the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Which is how it was all coming together. So he agreed to stay. So what now happened? 24th of June 1905. Do you remember I mentioned there was a big demonstration or a big event in Altrincham? All the nonconformist churches marched into the centre of Altrincham from different starting points, starting at 10:15 p.m. Would we do that these days? I don't think we'd get a licence, would be allowed. And they sang All Hail the Power of Jesus' Name and other songs. And they carried Japanese and Chinese lanterns, so they marched from all the different locations. And one started with a band outside here, led by Cowell Lloyd, of this church marching, and then others would join in as we went along. And on the way, they visited all the pubs, gave out tracts and asked people to come to the meetings. And there was a huge midnight rally in Altrincham. There were quite a few incidents with some drunk people in the meeting, it's recorded. But the idea was, it was an evangelistic rally, very daring to hold one at pub chucking out time, but there we are. And Lloyd was one of the chief organisers of that. And then, why did 5,000 people, it's between 4,000 and 5,000, the numbers differ, go to the River Bollin? This is the last bit, because we end up when this happens. Well, the baptisms in the Bollin, you may have heard of, in July 1905, and they were held near Primrose Cottages in Vicarage Lane, probably, I think, more like 4,000 spectators. That's, given the size of Altrincham at the time, that's a huge proportion of here walked out to the River Bollin to see what was going on. It was advertised in the papers, because Cowell Lloyd was great for putting out publicity, and they had a changing tent. They put the harmonica organ on a portable lorry. The church secretary had to organise everything, and he hired a lorry, and they trundled through the fields. And Cowell Lloyd was the main guy, of course. There's the changing tent, and you can just see the little things where they hung their coats and robes when they got changed to go into the river. And there, can you see the crowds on the top? Or dying to see what was happening. And this is one of the photographs. Now, it was reported in the local newspaper, and you can actually see the reporter, I think, there taking notes in his hat. And there's Cowell Lloyd in the river baptising someone, and apparently the river was really fast flowing. And in fact, you can get a sense of that from the reverse. They actually struggled to stay standing. And they also had a dog that ran to the river. They had to get the dog out at one point. But it was, and Cowell Lloyd preached a sermon basically to the people there. Charles and Ernest Southwell. Charles was the father of Ernest and Charles Frederick Southwell Jr., if you remember. And I think the person who was baptised there by Cowell Lloyd, again you can see the Fast River, is Cowell Lloyd, and I think that was the brother. I think that was Ernest Southwell, and you can see that we've got Dad, two of them on the bank holding the towel. I think that's Dad holding the towel, if you recognise from before. So I just want to finish really by saying what happened to Cowell Lloyd, because he was an amazing minister. He was ABC's longest-serving, I'm going to say senior pastor. For the moment, he was our longest-serving senior pastor. But in 1916, during the war, First World War, he left finally, and he moved to Denmark Hill in London, where the church grew in 6 years from 355 to 652. And when he left, guess what? The congregation tried to stop him leaving, and this time they surrounded the manse, the church, the house where he lived, and wouldn't let him leave. He and his wife leave until he agreed to stay. But this time he was a bit wise to it, so he'd already accepted to a position somewhere else. And guess where he went? You remember we talked about the Jamaican connection, his anti-slavery stance. His grandfather was a missionary in Jamaica with William Knibb. He went to Jamaica to Kingston Baptist Church, and he was a hero in Jamaica during his time there. In fact, certainly there was a call of the main Baptist church named after him. There was a book written about him called Colourblind, which is unfortunately one of the things that was in the bin. And I've got one of, I think, the only remaining copies I've managed to buy of that. It's an amazing story. Because when he was there, he realised that actually there was still a form of slavery, and that the people working on the plantations were being paid very low wages. So he helped them organise into trade unions to actually get better bargains. He retired in 1950, aged 84. He died in 1960, just before his 100th birthday. And when he died, in his will, there was a generous legacy to Altrincham Baptist Church. Isn't that nice? There's his legacy, and that is him very much in his later years as pastor emeritus of the main Baptist Church in Kingston, Jamaica. So we've been through the dramatic early years, if you remember all these people. Frank Crossley, John Betts, I have a suffragette there, William Crossley, the Liberal MP, McLaren, the great evangelist, William Llewellyn, first proper minister, Henry Mowbray, the controversial minister, and Cowell Lloyd. And then I think the intervention of the Holy Spirit to bring it all together. It was just an amazing story. So thank you very much for listening.